Are known for developing a whole bunch of different things, among which is in the art world, styles of art that are going to be incredibly influential. So these styles are going to be influential in Roman times, and then when we come back to Renaissance times, they're going to borrow from both the Greeks and the Romans. And then later on into like the 19th century, we're going to have neoclassicism that again is going to return all the way back to Greek times. So the Greek ideas are going to be really influential, and these art styles are going to be really influential. So Greek art is divided, and society is divided into three main time periods: the archaic, early stuff, and then the classical, which is really the high point of Greek ideas, and then Hellenistic, which is going to be sort of the end point when they sort of go in a different direction. Now, at the high point, especially at this classical time period, there are three key themes that are going to really tie together all of their ideas about art and society and religion. And those are going to be idealism, rationalism, and humanism. So when they make an artwork, when someone makes an artwork, you can be focused on making something, like if you're doing a portrait of someone, you can focus on making them idealized and more like your perfect image of what they should be. Or you can try to make them imperfect or distorted, or you can make them emotional, or you can make them individualistic. They're going to focus on idealized. So whether it's a portrait or it's a building, whether it's an image of a god, it's going to be as ideal as possible. The goal is to make everything as perfect as it possibly can be. They're going to come up with an ideal of perfection, and they're going to want to try to attain that. They're also really focused on rationalism. And rationalism is going to be seen, especially in their use of math, to make an artwork that is going to be logically explainable. So instead of looking at something and trying to make something that feels good or that feels beautiful, they're going to use math to come up with a mathematically perfect, mathematically beautiful thing. So we're going to see formulas being used in their depictions of bodies. We're going to see formulas used in their depictions of temples. And so they're going to believe that there's a rational explanation for beauty and a rational explanation for really most things. So we're going to see rationalism as a key theme there. And then we're also going to see humanism. So in some societies, they're going to focus on deities and gods that are much more sort of supernatural and all-knowing and very above humanity. That's not what the Greeks are going to do. The Greeks are going to create gods that are very close to humans. They're very similar to humans. They interact with humans. They have human failings. These are not gods who are perfect. They're gods who suffer from jealousy. They suffer from anger. They make poor choices. And so their gods themselves are going to be humanistic. We're also going to see that in their design of like temples, where the focus is, while it's still focused on idealism and perfection, it's done within a human sort of focus and a human realm. So we're going to see those as the three key themes in Greek art and society. We're going to generally see over time. So last class or video, we talked about archaic and classical. Now we're going to talk about sort of classical and then move into Hellenistic art. So classical art tends to focus on sort of stoic detachment, a lack of emotion, a lack of sort of visible emotion on, say, a face and such, to Hellenistic art, which focuses much more on strong emotion. So we're going to talk about how changes within their society lead them away from this sort of high point of classical art into artwork that is much more emotional and much more intense. We're also going to see how some of the ideal proportions end up modified over time and sort of changed as we move into Hellenistic art. And to see when we talk about art and art history is we often combine Greek and Roman together. And the reason for this, once we get to Roman art, we're going to talk about how the Romans really borrow from the Greeks and use a lot of Greek styles and a lot of Greek ideas in their own pieces. And so what we do is we often combine Greek and Roman together into this timeline, right? So this part down here is going to be the Greek part, archaic, classical, and Hellenistic, and then that kind of goes right into the Roman time. So we often call this whole time period classical, and we combine them together as classical art, which is Greek and Roman combined together. So that's going to come up later when we get to the Renaissance and we get to neoclassical, where they're borrowing from both of these different time periods. But when we just look at the Greeks, What we can tend to see is we see three phases where archaic is sort of them developing some ideas and figuring out what they're going to want to do. Classical is going to be the sort of high point where we see these at their most intense phase. And then Hellenistic is going to be a point at which their society starts to kind of lose some power. They lose some control. They lose some really important battles, and they kind of move back from some of these high points. They kind of emphasize these major themes a little bit less as we move into Hellenistic, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to Hellenistic. But during the classical time period, we're seeing these three key themes of idealism, humanism, and rationalism as really central. So idealism is going to be focused on this idea of wanting to depict the essence of beauty. They want to make something that is the most beautiful thing, the most perfect thing. They generally tend to believe an idea that everything in the world has a most perfect form. So trees, there is a perfect tree, and every tree strives to attain this perfect treeness. Every hill, every blade of grass, every flower, each of them, there's a perfect underlying phase that is like the perfect daffodil or the perfect rose. And every single rose you look at is slightly less perfect than that ideal. But one of the things that art can do is it can shed a light on this more perfect realm that you can't really see in the physical realm, but an artist can bring you towards that. So one goal of art is to depict these sorts of types, these more perfect underlying types in each thing that go further than the world around us towards this world of beauty. They're also going to focus on humanism, where their focus is really human proportions, human beings, human sizes and scales in their temples. Even their gods are going to be based on humans. When we think about Zeus and the ways in which he's going to like cheat on his wife and then get caught, and the choices she's going to make and the ways she's going to like fight back against different women, these do not seem like the choices of perfect beings. These seem like the choices of flawed humans. And so their gods really seem to be based on flawed humans rather than existing in some sort of more perfect realm. So we tend to see a lot of focus on humanism. And then we have rationalism. They're going to really focus on reason over emotion, except when we get to Hellenistic, and we'll see how that goes in a different direction. But during the classical phase, and normally when we think about Greek art, we focus on the idea of rationalism. They're going to use mathematical formulas for their art. They're going to write texts on their art theories. They're going to try to seek a rational explanation for things rather than focusing on emotion. They're going to see themselves as Greeks, as rational, logical people, in contrast to all of the peoples around them that they're constantly at war with, who they see as too emotional and not as rational. So they see themselves at this high point in all of civilization and such. And part of that is tied up into their focus on reason and logic. Greek temples, we're going to generally see them sort of filling this sort of design. So one thing we'll see a lot in classes where we talk about temples or designs, so we'll often see this kind of drawing, which just shows like a two-dimensional depiction of something from the front, and that's called an elevation. So an elevation is just the building seen from the front, not seen as sort of in three-dimensional point of view like this, or not showing the floor plan or something like that. So an elevation is something that's going to give us a sense of like what the building would look like just as you walk up to it. And you can see here, they're showing sort of a lot of the key parts. We're going to generally in a Greek temple see stairs the whole way around and columns the whole way around. And this gives a sense of openness that you can choose which way you walk up to it and which way you walk through it. We're generally going to see what we're going to call a pediment up here, and the pediment's going to refer to this triangularish area here. That usually is going to have a metope that's here, and it's got little sculptures there, as well as in this triangular area, we're going to see some bigger sculptures. Each of those things is going to be conveying key aspects of what the temple does or the stories related to it. We're usually going to have some sort of internal space, although it's often not fully enclosed. It doesn't necessarily have a door. It might be open to the elements. And that's often where we're going to have a sculpture towards a key, whichever god or gods we're focusing on in this temple. And we'll often do sacrifices there and such things. The temples are going to generally be made out of white marble, but at the time period, they would have all been painted in bright colors. So today we tend to think of these types of structures as just plain white marble, but that's really just because the paint has worn off over time. Okay. And so that's a pretty good example of what a Greek temple overall is generally going to look like. Columns, some interior space, a really important triangular pediment area up at the top that has key sculptures, and stairs letting you walk in from any direction. Really considered one of the best examples of sort of an ideal Greek classical temple. So this is a temple to the goddess Athena, and it's built in Athens. It's at the highest point in Athens, called the Acropolis. And it focuses on this one goddess, Athena. It is unusual because we know who the architects are. So Callicrates and Iktinos are the designers or the architects behind this building. And over on the right, we can see a floor plan. So this is in addition to an elevation, as we saw in the last slide, this is another type of design we're likely to see a lot in this class. A floor plan is one like this that shows you what the building would look like from the top. So you're going to see straight lines that are going to, so around the edges, you can see this is referring to the stairs. Here, you're seeing these thicker lines that are referring to walls. And each of those dots is then going to show you columns. So when we look at a floor plan, we're going to get a sense of what it would look like from the top, and that gives us a sense of the space. So this particular building is celebrating Athena, and it is, you can see, open in the front a bit. It has the ability to sort of enter it from any direction because it has these stairs all the way around it. Slide, I highlighted that you can enter the Parthenon from any particular direction. And that's true of the building itself, but it's not necessarily true of the entire site or the entire location. So one of the choices that they made in designing this, so they placed it at the top of the Acropolis, which is the highest point in Athens. And in order to get to this location, you have to walk up this way, and then you have to walk from this direction. So when you look at a photo of the Parthenon, you almost always see it from the same viewpoint. This is unusual, and it's an unusual viewpoint because you see it diagonally from the corner. And most buildings, if you just look them up on Google Images, you're going to see a whole bunch of photos from the front, because most of the time that's how people are going to approach most buildings and want to photograph it. This building's unusual because you never approach it directly at first from the front. You approach it from this diagonal angle. So this is the way that most people are going to want to photograph it. So the reason why you approach it from that angle is because it's at the top of this hill. So there's really not, like, you can't go up this way, you can't go up this way, because it's a cliff, right? And it's got walls. So they've placed it at the top of the Acropolis because the Acropolis is sort of the government and religious center. It's also the place that you would go if you were being attacked. So when we think about military strategy, there's often this statement of like keeping the high ground or taking the high ground. And that is important if you are in any sort of battle, because let's say you have cannons or you have swords or you have sticks, it's always better to have gravity on your side, and being up at the top, you have that extra power of gravity when you use your sword or your cannons or your stones or whatever you have. It also means you have a better viewpoint, so you can see who's attacking you and such. So having the high ground is really important. So if Athens were to be attacked, this is the place everyone would go. They would go up here to this government and religious center where it's really easily protected. And if someone were to be attacking you, they would have to go up these stairs. So this is where they go for safety, and this is where they go for protection. And in the past, there would have been this very huge sculpture of Athena. You can see here's a person down at the bottom, and then there's that huge sculpture of her. So there was this huge sculpture of Athena there. And they would every year have a procession up to the top of the Acropolis. It would follow this path, and then they would bring a new garment, a new outfit that they would carefully weave over a year, and then they would put it on top of the statue at the end. So this particular location is a really important location to Athens. The Acropolis is, because of course Athena is their main goddess, because it's Athens, and she's their main protector. And so this temple is made to celebrate her as this most important figure who's going to help the people of Athens. When we think about how the Parthenon includes these key ideas of humanism and idealism and rationalism, one way we see the focus on humanism is the fact that they planned the entry, the pathway, the way that you first approach that building, as one that is focused on humans and how humans walk up to it. Because when you think about how the goddess Athena might approach it, I'm going to imagine maybe it's by chariot from the sky. I don't know if she's going to approach it diagonally or from the front or from the side. But they've come up with that plan where humans are going to walk up those stairs and see it diagonally from that direction. One of the reasons why they want you to do that is that they think of that diagonal approach as the most rational one. Now, that might seem weird because it doesn't necessarily seem like there's a rational way to approach a building. But if you think about walking up to the art annex, if you walk up to the art annex from the front door, you don't get a really good sense of the building as it is, because the building doesn't make a lot of sense from the front. You can't imagine the whole hallway back to the back. You can't imagine the back building and how they're sort of interconnected. But if you were to walk past the art annex towards the band building and approach it diagonally, you would be approaching the building in what they would see as a more rational point of view. You see the front and you see the side at once, and you have a better sense of the space. So that's their idea of a rational approach to a building, is a diagonal one where you immediately fully understand the space as a whole. It's also humanist because it's about how humans walk on their feet on the ground, which isn't necessarily how goddesses and gods walk. Okay, so we've got rationalism in the approach, we've got humanism in the approach. We also have rationalism in terms of how they've designed the different parts of the building using math. So they've used something called the golden mean or the golden ratio in order to design the building. The golden mean or the golden ratio is something that comes from nature. So what the Greeks do is they look out at different things in nature, shells and cacti and sunflowers. This is also the case with galaxies or hurricanes. And they find this pattern where it can produce this continual extension where this sunflower could go on endlessly using the same numbers, or this shell can. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a rectangle and we're going to extend it 2/3 further up. Then we're going to go to the left side and we're going to extend it 2/3 further than we already have. We're going to go down, we're going to go 2/3 further. We're going to go out to the side 2/3 further. And this is going to continually expand outwards in this ever increasing spiral that we can call the golden mean or the golden ratio. It's not quite exactly 2/3, but it's a slightly more complicated mathematical formula that we'll talk about in the next slide, actually. It's sometimes simplified, though, as the rule of thirds. So we often talk about this same golden mean or golden ratio or rule of thirds in photography. And in photography, they usually use this to refer to the idea that you probably shouldn't put your horizon line across the middle of the canvas, the print or the photo. You should put it 2/3 of the way up or 2/3 of the way down. When you put a key figure or a key important thing, you probably shouldn't put it right in the middle. You should put it about 2/3 of the way across or 2/3 of the way the other way. So again, here you see about 2/3 of the way up, about 2/3 of the way across. And this is just seen as something that comes from nature and is seen as particularly harmonious and beautiful. The idea is it's a mathematical formula that nature already had, and then humans rationally figure out how to apply this to artworks, how to apply this to buildings. And it's something we see continually reappearing in the history of art since then. But the Greeks are the ones who take it from nature and develop it mathematically, and we see this rationalism in terms of their use of this in art. Guys, we get to do algebra. I know you're excited. Everyone loves when I bring in an algebraic formula. So I don't know that I do it more times than this one, but I do it this time. So the golden mean or the golden ratio can also be expressed. So on the last slide, it was more expressed geometrically in terms of space, and here it's being expressed algebraically. So you can also algebraically express this formula as x equals 2y plus 1, and this is a formula you will want to remember in the future. X equals 2y plus 1. And the way that we use that is when we look at the building, we can see that along this short side, they've put 8 columns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to substitute that 8 for y here. And that is going to be 2 times 8 plus 1. And this tells us that on the long side, we're going to need to put 17 columns. And so you have 17 columns on the long side. This particular formula is going to be used over and over in this building because this is the formula that is the golden mean or the golden ratio. And we're going to use this for all sorts of different proportions, sizes, measurements, lengths, widths, all of those sorts of things. And so the idea is we go to nature to find this formula, we bring it into the building, we apply it throughout, and this brings us this sense of harmony. Through rationalism, it brings us this ideal perfection using math to bring it to us. A little more complicated than even just learning algebraic formulas. So all of those things I've said so far about the Parthenon apply to quite a large number of classical Greek temples. So a lot of Greek temples are going to have the golden mean or the golden ratio, this focus on idealism, this focus on rationalism and humanism. But one thing that sets the Parthenon even further apart from other temples and makes it this sort of high point of all of Greek temple construction is that there's a whole nother thing they did. It's called optical corrections or optical refinements. Now, typically when you look at a very large building or a very large thing, there are going to be some optical illusions that your eye is going to come up with. And these things are going to make the building look less perfect. If it has straight lines, but it's really, really long, your eye is going to see it as not having straight lines. And so one of the things so that's an optical illusion that your eye brings to something. What the architects did with the Parthenon was they determined how your eye would see the building imperfectly, and they corrected for it. So they take this thing about human eyes, the ways that we see optical illusions, and they correct for it. So I can see this as really one of the most intense ways in which they engage in humanism, is that it's hard to imagine that the gods and goddesses have the same optical illusions as we do. Maybe they do, but this building is built so as to correct for those. So there are no straight lines. Instead, everything is slightly curved to counteract these various optical corrections, these various optical illusions. So the effects are not going to be visible, but they're going to change how you're going to see the temple anyway. Examples of the optical effects and the ways and the things they're correcting. So if you look at an incredibly long bookcase, even though all of the lines, and even if it's got perfectly straight bookshelves and they're not actually sagging, if it's a really long bookshelf, they're going to start to seem to sag in the middle. Similarly, if you look at a lot of very straight vertical lines next to each other, the spaces between these lines in the middle are not necessarily going to seem the same as the spaces on the edges. And this is because the ones in the middle have lines next to them, and that changes your experience of the space between them compared to the ones on the edges. So if you just look at a really long building, long straight lines are going to appear to sag. So to correct for that, they curve the floor slightly up in the middle, and they curve the ceiling slightly up in the middle. When you look at a whole bunch of columns all in a line, vertical lines like this, they're going to see, and you look at them from way down here, when you're standing here looking up, they're going to seem to push outward here. They're going to seem further apart. So to counteract that, they've tilted them slightly inward. We're also generally, if we look at a whole bunch of columns all in a row, those ones, they're going to seem to be thinner in the center than they are at the top. So they have swelled them in the middle to solve that problem. Also, because of the background here compared to the columns being lined up next to each other here, corner columns are going to appear thinner, and the gap between them is going to appear larger if you don't counteract them. So corner columns are instead wider, and the gap is smaller. So all of these effects are effects that you won't see visibly when you look at the Parthenon. But they are things that when you look at another temple might make it seem slightly inferior, slightly imperfect, slightly less harmonious. And so what they've done is they've studied how other temples look, how your eye works, and they've counteracted that with these fixes. See a list of some of the optical corrections and refinements. So these counteract the optical effects and they make the work look more dynamic. So the floor is going to curve very slightly up in the middle. This is like 1/600th. So it's not a significant amount, but it does mean every single stone block that they carved for this had to be very slightly not a straight line. The ceiling has to curve up again very slightly in the middle. The columns have to tilt in slightly at the top. In fact, they tilt in so much that if the building were 1.5 miles tall, all of these columns would in the end meet because they're slightly tilting inward. They also swell slightly up at the top, more than they would otherwise, and the corner columns are wider as compared to the columns in the middle. So these are all sort of optical corrections that are being included to make this building seem more perfect, which is that triangular area up at the top of the Parthenon. We're going to talk further in the future, or depending on how the class is scheduled. We've already talked about the Elgin marbles, and so these are these ones. So these are the three graces that would have appeared here, and they were taken off of it and taken to London. So we don't see those as part of it anymore. So the Parthenon is in pieces, and when you look at the building itself, a lot of these pieces have been taken elsewhere. Some of the Metope sculptures. These are mostly actually still in Greece, but they're also not actually on the Parthenon. They've been taken for safekeeping into a museum. These ones tend to show a series of legendary battles. So these are battles from the pre-Greek time period, where they see their ancestors, the Lapiths, fighting against centaurs. And this highlights one key Greek theme, the idea that they see themselves and their ancestors as rational and reasonable and ideal and human, in contrast to the sort of barbarian animal nature of other peoples, in this case, centaurs. So the centaurs are going to be the ancestors of the people they're now fighting against. They're going to be the ancestors of people they see as barbarians, whereas they themselves see themselves as human and ideal and reasonable. And we're going to see these sorts of themes and myths in their artworks and their creation stories a lot. This one, the key thing we're supposed to see over and over again, like it doesn't seem like a particularly fair battle between a centaur and a human. Centaur seems like it could be pretty strong in this, but that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen in all of these instances is reason is going to win out, humanity is going to win out, and the animal passions are going to lose, because that's going to be sort of a central theme that they want to highlight, is reason over barbarianism, or reason over animal passions and that sort of thing. About Greek myths and Greek religion, it can sometimes be hard to imagine this religion in which we have centaurs and we have Zeus and we have Hera, and Zeus is turning into animals at various points, and all of these things are happening. And it can be hard to relate this to the Greek focus on rationalism and reason and math, and all of their general focuses on logic and such. So it can be helpful to think about why the Greeks are interested in turning their gods into humans. So here we have a quote by one Greek who's talking about this idea of anthropomorphism, or making the gods into humans like us. So he says, but mortals believe the gods to be created by birth, and to have their own, mortals, raiment, that's clothing, voice and body. Ethiopians have gods with snub noses and black hair, so that's their idea. That's their, at this time period, description of black people. Thracians have gods with gray eyes and red hair. But if oxen and horses and lions had hands, or could draw with hands and create works of art like those made by men, horses would draw pictures of gods like horses, and oxen of gods like oxen. And they would make the bodies of their gods in accordance with the form that each species itself possesses. So what he's highlighting here is the idea that people want to see, people, like I guess horses and oxen, want to see some of themselves in their own gods. And the Greeks take this quite far in terms of their depiction of their gods as very much like them, and connected to them and tied to them, and having the same sorts of issues and concerns that they have. Another thing that comes up with the Greeks, though, is this question of the extent to which they see their myths as literal truth, or maybe as meaningful tales or meaningful stories. And on the one hand, the Greeks tend to be very, very religious. So Greeks are generally as a whole quite religious, and religion plays a very important role in Greek life for most people. This is not a society that tends to leave religion as an occasional thing. It tends to be very much constant daily worship, a lot of focus on using the gods to make decisions, in fortune telling and that sort of thing. But it can also be hard to connect this idea of a society that's interested in using algebra to find beauty to believing in centaurs. And so it's important to note that they don't necessarily fully see their stories and their myths most of the time as literally true. They tend to see them as things that are going to be narratives that bring meaning, but not necessarily as an actual thing that actually happened. So in this case, when we think about centaurs, they're probably not necessarily thinking of a centaur as a thing that completely existed, but more as a symbolic representation of barbarianism, a symbolic representation of someone who lets their passions and their animal instincts and their feelings control them instead of letting their brain rule them. So another Greek wrote about whether the tales or myths are believable or not. So he wrote a series of books called On Unbelievable Tales. And he said, now some people who have no acquaintance with philosophy or science are too credulous, that means too believing, and believe everything that is said to them. Others, of a more subtle and inquisitive nature, totally disbelieve that any of these tales ever happened. My own belief is that there is a reality behind all stories. For names alone without stories would hardly have arisen. First, there must have been deeds, and thereafter stories about them. So what he's arguing here is that things did happen. There was a Trojan War. There were these key figures. There were heroes that existed. And then Achilles later on developed a more complicated myth, or Hercules developed a more complicated myth or story that may have been woven further into. And this seems to be a fairly common Greek attitude, where there's some truth to these tales and these myths and these stories, but there's also elements that are more just about deriving meaning from it without it necessarily having to be 100% entirely correct as a thing that happened in the past. Things with the Parthenon in terms of idealism, rationalism, and humanism. So they're going to build the temple based on their values of rationalism and humanism. Their perfect temple, it's going to be based on math, and it's going to be based on how humans see the world, how humans approach the world, and such. In mind, when we look at Greek temples or when we look at Greek sculptures, is that we're not necessarily seeing them, we're not seeing them in their original form. We're seeing them with damage, we're seeing them with destruction, we're seeing them with paint removed, and we're seeing them sometimes with additions. So one thing you want to keep in mind is when you think about a sculpture, if parts of it are broken, so here you can see a sculpture that has an arm that's broken off, we're going to see ones without heads and such, you generally want to think about and imagine the sculpture in its whole original state, not in its broken form. So you want to think about what this would have originally done. Obviously, that sculpture originally had an arm. So you want to try to think more about what they originally did. But another thing you're generally going to see a lot in these sculptures is these sorts of supports that are a little odd, that jut out like that. And these highlight the fact that we are definitely not seeing these marble sculptures in their original state. And that is because the Greeks actually make a lot of sculptures in marble. They usually made them in bronze. So they're usually made in metal and they're hollow. The Romans later came along, and the Romans really liked marble, and the Romans were really good at copying, and they loved just copying things. They made perfect copies of tons of things all of the time. And they tended to make a lot of marble copies of Greek bronze originals. So in the Roman time period, you would have had a range of Greek bronze originals and Roman perfect copies of these things in marble. Now, much later on, as we get into like the Middle Ages, and we have a rejection of these as pagan artworks, and we also want a lot of bronze to make things like cannons and other weapons, what's going to happen is we're going to melt down most of the bronze sculptures that we find, and then we're going to get rid of those bronze originals. So those originals would end up usually being melted down, at later points. Marble, however, really can't be melted down to make a sculpture, so they didn't do that. But when the Romans made their copies of the Greek originals, one of the things they had to do was they would have to slightly modify some parts of the sculpture because it's a different material and it has a different weight. So a bronze sculpture weighs a lot less because it's hollow than a marble sculpture. So in order to get the balance right, one thing you're going to often have to do is you're going to have to add a tree trunk, like we see back here, or you're going to have to add this sort of column here, or this vase and this here, that maybe wasn't in the original, and that's to give it better balance. You also have to often add these little struts or supports, and this is partially because if you have like someone's arm just sticking out like this in a bronze sculpture and it breaks off, you can reattach it. Again, here, if it broke off, you could reattach it. And also it's slightly bendier in bronze, so it's less likely to break. But in marble, it's easily breakable and you can't reattach it, really. I mean, we have our ways, but you can't really reattach it. And so those supports also make it so that it's a little harder for something to just break off. And so those are things that, again, when we're really thinking about how the work originally looked, we can kind of imagine those as not really essential. So there are some parts that are maybe later additions, especially by the Romans. An example of original. So here, actually, I don't think that's an original. I think it's another marble, and I think it's another bronze copy. So this right here is going to be a bronze copy of a bronze original, and then a marble copy of a marble original. We usually look in this case at the marble original because it seems better. The marble copy instead of the bronze copy because it seems probably better executed for complicated reasons. Okay, so, but with this bronze, you can see that he doesn't need, not right there, I'm looking at the wrong place. Here, you can see that this tree stump has been added to add support here that is not needed if the sculpture is made out of bronze. We've added this little strut here that keeps the hand from breaking off if something were to like get in there or it were to fall on its side. So those are things that we kind of ignore when looking at a sculpture like this. In order, if we're focused on thinking about what the original Greek bronze would have looked like. Classical Greek time period, the Greeks really see themselves as the world leaders. They are the rational, the logical people. They have math in support of them. They have reason. They have all of these things that have led them to be able to conquer much of the known world. So they have, during the time of Alexander the Great, conquered this much of the world. They've expanded this far out. And so as a result, they have a lot of faith in themselves. They have a lot of faith in their abilities and their ideas. They see themselves as rational and everyone else as these barbarians that'll be better off if the Greeks take control of them, spread their ideas, spread their artworks, and so forth. So we tend to see artworks that are very confident, that are very based on bringing these three themes to the rest of the world. And then things kind of start to collapse. So at the time that Alexander the Great dies, he has this huge empire. This whole thing is the empire he's expanded to. But he doesn't have one accepted heir. We do not have the same type of political leadership. We don't have the same type of certainty. The empire starts to collapse. We start to lose battles. We've spread Greek culture throughout this whole empire, but we're starting to feel like instead of being constantly on this confident expansion and certain of ourselves and our future, we start to feel like we maybe don't have that anymore. And we're losing battles, we're losing general wars for control over the world and the world of ideas and all of these things. So as the empire starts to fall apart, our ideals start to change. We move away from those central ideas of rationalism and humanism and idealism towards more of a focus on the individual, more of a focus on the specific. So you might move away from an idealized portrait towards a portrait that looks more like you as an actual person. We're also going to move more towards emotion. We're still going to have some focus on reason, but emotion starts to become much more important. This is why up here I've put emotion with 3 exclamation marks. So Hellenistic's key thing is emotion. We move away from reason as necessarily the key thing that sets humans and Greeks apart. and maybe emotion's going to become more important. We also have drama. These are going to be really dramatic, really emotional works that are going to go in a whole different direction than that rational, logical direction we had before. And it really comes out of this loss of confidence as the empire starts to collapse, where instead of seeing ourselves as fully unified in a world where the Greeks are the leaders and we're all interconnected, we start to infight as we lose power. And so we tend to focus a lot more on ourselves as individuals and our individual feelings and emotions instead of what connects us as Greeks. When we move from those Doric and Ionic columns into the Corinthian ones. And so this is a temple from this Hellenistic time period that is not in great condition. So as you can see, this is the only part of it that remains from what would have existed here. So we have this and like a limited number of a few columns here. But one of the key things we see here is these capitals are in this Corinthian style that is a style that we closely tie to drama and emotion and such things. Hellenistic sculpture of an enemy. This is a dying Gallic trumpeter. And we can see this is a trumpeter because he's got a trumpet down here. And we can see that he's Gallic because he is wearing this necklace that sets him apart as a Gaul. He also has a mustache, which is going to be seen as a sign of a barbarian. So here we see him dying. And that highlights the fact that we as Greeks are winning this battle and we are defeating him. But it also shows him as pretty strong. Even though he's in his pose shows him to be dying, his head, his neck sort of bending down like that as a warrior is going to show that he is dying. We also see that he's quite muscular. He's not shown as incredibly weak. And this is a way in which we can show our strength. So by showing the strength of our enemies who are dying, we can highlight that we were the ones who were able to defeat them. So even though he isn't shown as that weak, he's still shown as muscular because that highlights our power. This work to an earlier archaic work, we can really see what the Greeks are doing in terms of depicting figures as more humanistic, with more of a focus on emotions and individualism. It looks much more like a real person. We've got much more of a focus on I'm going to say accurate, realistic characterization of emotions in both the body and the face. So we've moved away from the archaic smile, and we've moved away from a pose that looks not particularly weak or like he's dying here. He just looks kind of like he's showing off his muscles, and especially with the leg crossed here. In contrast to here, where he looks a lot more like he is actually resting his hand for support. His back and his neck show that he is sort of losing power and collapsing and going down in on himself. The facial expression is no longer an archaic smile. So we're able to show emotion with a way other than just an archaic smile. We're able to show it with facial expressions, with bodies, with poses, all of those things. And so we're still showing a warrior who's dying, but we've also shown some of these changes that come out of the Hellenistic one, which is a sculpture that became incredibly influential in, say, the late Renaissance through much of the Baroque on into the 19th century. And that's because this was a sculpture that was excavated fairly early, and it became really a symbol of what the Greeks could do, and became something that people really talked about when they talked about Greek sculpture. Which is interesting because it's not a great example of classical Greek sculpture. It's a great example of Hellenistic Greek sculpture. So this highlights how our ideas of a particular society change as we discover more stuff about them. We might, if the first thing we discover is a very late artwork like this one, come up with a fairly inaccurate idea of what this culture values. And then over time, as we define more artworks and learn more about them, we might come up with a better picture. So in this case, this is a really great example of a Hellenistic sculpture. Tons of emotion, tons of drama. We have picked a moment of high excitement, and with the poses and the bodies and all of these things, we've made it even more exciting. So this is a story from the time period of the Trojan War. And so the Trojan War is a really long war that is going to be fought over Helen of Troy and questions to do with whether Paris should have taken her, whether she should have stayed with her original husband, complicated things there. But this is the part a bit later on where what the Greeks have done is they've created the Trojan horse, this big empty wooden horse, as a gift to say they're willing to end the war. They put it, they give it as an offering. And the idea is that they're saying, we will end the war and we will leave. So they leave it there, but they have in fact left a whole bunch of soldiers inside of it who are going to, once the horse is brought into the city, those soldiers are going to unlock the city, and the soldiers are going to come in and take the city. So it is a form of trickery to win this war. But Laocoon here, he sought to warn the Trojans not to accept this horse, not to accept things from the Greeks. He says the Greeks are always duplicitous and we should not trust them and take this horse. But in the process, he angers the gods. He specifically angers Poseidon, because the Trojan War, in addition to being a war among humans, is a war among gods, where they're each picking different sides and they have favorites and that sort of thing. So this is an example of a time period where this is an example of a story where the gods are really using humans as pawns. One god is going to use Laocoon to try to stop another god, and then that other god is going to get mad and he is going to go after Laocoon instead of the other god. And this sort of thing happens a fair amount in this sort of time period, in these sorts of myths. But we want to also keep in mind that idea of the extent to which these are supposed to be real things that actually happened or not real things that actually happened. So sometimes the Greeks are probably looking at these as a story that tells us about the world and tells us about people, but maybe not a real thing that happened. In this case, what we're seeing, so I've just included a small portion from the Aeneid by Virgil, where we're talking about the sea serpents coming for Laocoon and his two sons. Though the still see from Tenedos afar, lo, two great coiled snakes, with much turning, first throw the flood toward the land in yearning. My spirit abhors this matter to declare. So Virgil is here saying that he's going to tell you a terrible story, and he doesn't like this story either, but he has to tell it to you. Above the water their necks stand aware, with bloody crests outwith the walls gigantic. The remnant swam, always under the flat pelagic, with grisly bodies linked many-fold. There shall flame flourish from the rush they hold. Into the ground they glided with glowing evening, stuffed full of venom, fire and foul teething. These are the snakes, with tongues flickering in their mouths red. They like the twin killing stings in their head. So they're twin snakes, and then they also have twin fangs. We fled away all bloodless for fear, but with a braid to Laocoon to tear. They start attacking. So everyone else flees, but Laocoon is attacked, and his two sons sing. First the other serpent latched on like a ring, and with their cruel bite and sting they fell. Of tender limbs took many a sorry morsel. So they're biting the kids, they're latching onto them and such. Next they, the priest, invaded, both to entwine. The priest in this case is Laocoon. Whence with his weapons did his body pine, his children for to help and rescue. Both they about him looped in knots through, and twice circled his middle round about, and twice folded their scaly skin, but doubt about his crown, both neck and head they scrag. So one of the things we can see here is how the artists have made some different choices, right? So we've actually got a description of the fact that the serpents are twice around Laocoon, but the artists really want to show off his body and his muscles, and so they don't do that. They're highlighting their own interpretation of this sort of dramatic moment, but they're really building on Virgil in a lot of ways by turning this into this dramatic emotional moment where he wants to save his sons, but he can't save his sons, and they're looking to him for help, but he is himself taken by these snakes. And this whole thing then is this description of this scene where it is the gods who are fighting their own battle and using these mortals as their pawns. And that's one of the reasons why Virgil here is so unhappy to say this thing. This is typically seen as one of the more is one of many problematic Greek stories of mortals and children dying just because of the foibles of the gods. Nike, or Victory of Samothrace. And this is an example of a work that highlights this Hellenistic focus on drama. We have a winged goddess who would have previously had arms and also a head. Coming in speedily, we see her wings and her garments, everything is flowing in the air. The forward momentum is really key to this sort of drama, and the backward wings are giving us this sort of counterbalance to the strength of the body. This is a work that would have been very theatrical, not just in terms of the drama, but also in terms of the fact that in a theatrical play, we often would have, we always, I think, at the end of a Greek drama, the gods would come in and they would determine the ending. So you don't determine the ending, the gods themselves sort of fly in some fashion, tell you what's going to happen, and then that determines the ending of it. And it highlights the idea that the gods are the ones in control. And so this particular sculpture is supposed to reference that idea. It might have stood in a niche above a theater, and may have had a fountain, and it would have highlighted this idea of that final moment at the end of a dramatic play when the gods come in and they determine who is victorious, and they give the victory to this person or to that person or such. Always keep in mind that no time period is definitively all 100% one thing. There's always something that's going on that doesn't fit our narrative. So in art history and in history, what we're always doing is we're always telling stories about the past that hopefully best explain the key themes or the key issues. But as part of that, you're always sort of leaving some things out. There's always some counter narratives. There's always some things that maybe don't fit. And so when we look at this time period, we are going to see, so if we look at Old Woman on the left, we see a woman who's going to she is bringing a chicken and a basket, and she is probably going to a temple with some sacrifices. And we can see this Hellenistic focus on emotion and individuality. We can see how this is different from a classical work because it much more shows this one person with like her clothes not in perfect condition, her skin, her breasts, everything sort of older, her clothes sort of falling off of one breast in a way that wouldn't have been appropriate. But it's giving us a real sense of this person in this time period at this age. And that's very Hellenistic. But it's also the case that a particularly famous sculpture that shows sort of classical beauty, Aphrodite of Milos or Venus de Milo, comes from this time period as well. So while Hellenistic art is all about emotion and individualism and drama, and not necessarily about classical beauty and idealism, we also have works like this one by Alexandros that really seem much more classical. It really fits a lot of our ideas from earlier time periods that he's just brought back. And so any time period is always going to have outliers. We're always going to have things that maybe don't fit our narrative that well. And we're going to try to tell a story that fits best with what most Greeks are doing or what the main focus is. But there's always going to be someone who's doing something from an earlier time period, or maybe leading the direction towards a new time period, or just doing something very individualistic. And we're going to always see things like that happening as well. Some of these artworks are going to come up a lot in pop culture, so it's helpful to note in this case that the Venus de Milo is also the Gummy de Milo, which, as we see here in The Simpsons, as the Gummy de Milo.